Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. Actually, let me turn on a light real quick. It's a little dark in here. Hello, I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a good start to your week. My name is Julian, and if you are new here, this is a weekly Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture that I've been hosting for the past 2.5 years, almost 3 years by now. And basically every Monday, I try to start our week together in a philosophical fashion with a 50-minute introductory lecture that focuses on continental theory and philosophy with a special emphasis on Slavoj Žižek's work, psychoanalysis, as well as a bunch of artistic and literary references thrown in as well. These lectures are entirely free for anybody who'd like to access them. They're open access because I believe that learning is fun and that everybody should be able to participate in that without having to need a philosophy degree. However, let it be noted that these lectures are nevertheless slightly more, let's say, advanced. They're meant to be not for complete beginners, but slightly more advanced readers and learners. Hopefully that is stimulating to you, and even if you are a complete beginner, then perhaps this will be a pathway into further reading and study for you. I would like to say a huge thank you to all of the patrons who continue to make this project possible in the first place, who allow me to keep hosting these lectures for free. If you'd like to become a patron, you can download my ebook Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, which is part of a quarterly ebook subscription where I release a new ebook every 3 months. If you'd like to download that, please consider becoming a patron by going to www.patreon.com/GentlemanJulian or clicking the link that I'll post in the description. Now, if you're familiar with this process, you know what I'm about to say, which is I would love it if you left me a comment letting me know where you are joining us from. I already see someone from Austria. Hello, good morning, Austria. It gives me great joy, great pleasure to know that we are connecting philosophically across the world. I see Mexico. Hello, Mexico. That is absolutely wonderful. Ukraine, hello, solidarity with you, Ukraine. Reykjavik, Serbia, Slovenia. That's absolutely wonderful. And if you're watching on Instagram, I would also like to say that if you'd like to donate to these lectures, please consider becoming an Instagram subscriber for just $5 a month. That gets you access to exclusive reading recommendations and daily philosophical content that I post. I see California, I see Germany, France, Wisconsin, UK. It's incredible. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's jump right in. Today, the topic that I would like to discuss, the lecture title is going to be Love Without the Fall, which I'm going to relate to a theosophical question, namely Christ, fetish, or not. That is going to be the topic for today. And this ties into our lecture series, which is titled The Divine Madness, which I've uploaded all the previous lectures as well, if you'd like to watch those in your own time. So make yourself comfortable. We're going to be here for about, 45 minutes or so. And yeah, I feel like it's both too bright and too dark somehow this morning. Is that better? I think that's a little bit better, isn't it? Okay. All right, let's begin. One of the common accusations apropos Christianity, both from a Roman pagan position as well as from a more contemporary atheist stance, is that Christianity has a weird obsession with death, with Christ on the cross, that Christ is a kind of fetish object. In fact, I remember being relatively young and walking into a church one day, and someone said how easy it is to understand the Roman revulsion with Christianity. All one has to do is imagine walking into a contemporary cult and seeing a man in the electric chair being executed and putting this up on the wall. What a morbid image. How could you believe in this? Essentially, the argument here would be that the Romans had an perhaps understandable hesitancy to endorse a death cult that worshiped the idea of Christ on the cross, etc. common atheist stance, I think, to represent Christianity not being about agape, about the idea of universal love, but as being a kind of morbid, symptomatic emergence towards the end of the Roman Empire that represents the transition from an emphasis on life and the, let's say, the pleasurable emphasis on the gods as being hedonistic deities towards a much more morbid, dark, cult-like fascination with death that would then eventually lead to sort of more Protestant Calvinistic tendencies of self-flagellation, etc. Now, this is an understandable position to some extent, and yet here it can be extremely helpful to consider the psychoanalytic idea of the fetish, which isn't strictly speaking just psychoanalytic. After all, one of the most famous Marxist concepts is the idea of the fetish. Now, strictly speaking, the definition of the fetish is something that believes for you in your place. That's something that, some object, something that embodies or materializes the absence of your belief in its stead. For example, let's say that you're someone who doesn't find direct sexual pleasure in intercourse. Well, if you have a fetish object, the fetish object takes on the sexual charge for you in its place. Hence also why the fetish object tends to be, by definition, a desexualized, supposedly neutral object that represents sex for you where sex was not supposed to be, as it were. Not in a normative sense, but as in the empty object onto which sex is posited. You could also argue that from a non-sexual perspective, although of course within psychoanalysis the sexual element here has to be of course precisely retained, we could find the same thing, the same fetishistic enjoyment when it comes to a relic. A sacred relic is not simply a proof of the once living existence of a saint, for example. A sacred relic is, here is the thing that stands in for my belief. Where I had doubt, which of course Christianity is a doubt-centric faith, we can come back to that in a moment, where I had doubt, here we have this object that rids me of the burden of my doubt, and instead I can place my faith, my belief into it. It believes on my behalf. Hence also the centrality of the idea of the relic to the institution of the church. After all, the institution of the church is the fetishistic idea simply raised to the level of a centralized site, which is to say, you may have doubts, you may not be a quote-unquote true believer, you may be a sinner, however, the church will believe on your behalf. It's also the fetishistic aspect of the confession of sin within the Catholic faith, namely the idea being that you can confess and therefore you have relieved your burden onto the institution who can do the praying for you, who can do the believing for you. And once unburdened, you can therefore go back into the world and technically resume your sinful life as long as you maintain this ritualistic participation in what is therefore essentially a fetishistic process. Now, once again, this is not a normative argument. I'm not saying that this is bad. Instead, what I'm trying to argue is that the idea of the fetish is actually how a form of paganism is maintained within the Christian faith, within the early Christian faith especially. Think about one of the contemporary fetishes of capitalism, which is the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is, of course, the most recognizable pagan icon or pagan remnant that nevertheless persists within contemporary Christian economies, by which I mean the Christian libidinal economy of investing the family, like the most sacred family holiday that combines consumer pleasures with private familiar pleasures, with the coming together around the Christmas tree, etc. Here again, we have what is not just a pagan relic within Christianity, but a distinctly fetishistic relic within Christianity. Now, apropos the argument, the atheist or let's say pagan stance that Christ is the ultimate fetish, here we have to go in the exact opposite direction. My argument is very simple. My argument is that Christ on the cross, rather than being the ultimate fetish symbol, is in fact the exact other thing. Christ on the cross is the de-fetishization of what you might call the Old Testament faith, the idea of the God in the sky, the higher authority, etc. In fact, it is only through Christ on the cross, through the fall into this mortal body, that we find the process by which true authentic subjectivity emerges, namely the subject of interpassivity, which I'll explain later, rather than the fetishistic subject who simply interrelates with the fetishistic object. Now, as I said before, one of the key principles of the fetish object is that it does the believing on our behalf, that we don't have to fully believe or invest ourselves in it. The object will do it for us. This means that, for example, within the pagan faith, the central fetishistic aspect of the pagan faith lies within the exchange formula of do ut deet. Namely, I give so that I might receive. I will make a sacrifice to appease the gods, which is therefore a formal exchange. Even if I don't know exactly what the gods want from me, I will give it to them, thereby expecting that I will be granted a bountiful harvest, for example. This could be a simple exchange. This central principle of exchange that we see within the pagan faith therefore functions along the lines of the fetish object. Namely, the sacrifice, which could be like, for example, you burn a cow or something, or you slaughter a goat. This exchange is fetishistic because the goat cannot be properly consumed by the god in any way. It cannot be properly put to use. Instead, the physical object of the goat that is being sacrificed becomes the vanishing mediator by which the social relations between the living subject and the deity is sustained. Strictly speaking, the goat, therefore, doesn't simply just evaporate into heaven, which would be a retroactive sort of cultural religious supplement to try to eradicate the more traumatic aspect of this vanishing mediator. Instead, the goat has to fade away into the merely abstract facilitator of this interaction. Here you can already see how within the fetish we have therefore not interpassivity, we have interaction. We have an exchange by which what is essentially an empty object, for example, the ritually slaughtered goat, is exchanged so as to allow for the do ut deet principle by which I give to the gods and I expect that they will give back to me. Of course, this is not a formal contract by any means. It's not clear whether or not I will receive something in return. In fact, it could be an entirely preventative measure. And if it appears to work, if I appear to have received a bountiful harvest, then of course I will continue to do it again. It's a little bit like the logic from 20 years ago when it came to counterterrorism measures, where the secret services would say, you have to keep giving us more money. And we'd say, why should we keep giving you more money? After all, there haven't been any terror attacks. And they say, aha, this is exactly why you should give us more money, because if you don't give us more money, then the terror attacks will resume. This is the central bargain of do ut deet, which is that I make a sacrifice of the fetish object, which disappears into thin air, and what I receive in return is not something. What I receive in return is nothing, namely the absence of the thing that I fear. And therefore the fetishistic relationship is what sustains through this abstract object the social relations of interactivity between the human subject and the idea of the deity. It's the central libidinal economy, if you will, of the pagan faith. Let's take a moment there because we're going fast. Now remember that I argued that Christ on the cross represents a shift, a kind of radical disorientation of the central libidinal economy, the central logic or ontological principle. Christ on the cross is precisely not the human sacrifice who, like a goat, is slaughtered and therefore disappears so as to allow for the continual interactive participation between the human symbolic order, which is upheld by the idea of the deity, the godly order. Instead, Christ is the splinter in the eye, if you will, of the deity through which we can see the truth. That Christ on the cross, therefore, rather than being the empty fetish object, which is sacrificed on behalf of the gods, is, in a sense, in a almost pervertedly radical inversion, is that which has to be sacrificed on behalf of man. In other words, the transition that occurs in Christ, as I've said before, is that what dies on the cross, as Hegel once argued, is not simply Christ. What dies on the cross is the idea of the logical order of the divine authority who has existed in exchange with humans. As Hegel puts it, what dies on the cross is not Christ, it is the God of the beyond. And what happens in this dialectical inversion is that therefore we go from an interactive relationship, namely the fetishistic logic of paganism, by which we have the fetish object that is sacrificed, that believes on our behalf in order to sustain the interactivity between man and God. We have the inversion of this logic into an interpassive relationship by which now it is precisely man who has to be responsible for his own actions, who has to believe for himself in himself. In a sense, what we have within the crucifixion is therefore the emptying out of the, let's say, the upper realm of divine authority and the transposition of this gap back into the human community, as it were, into the community of the faithful, the Holy Trinity, the Spirit, etc. Here we therefore have essentially the transition from a fetish object towards an object of, let's say, revolution, an object of defetishization, an object that thereby liberates. Hence also why the Christian emphasis is the emphasis on love. And here we have to be very specific. Remember the age-old rule that you cannot have love without the fall. That love, by its very nature, relies upon a kind of subjective destitution, if you will. This subjective destitution is exactly the love that is occurring within the crucifixion. When Christ says, where you will find love, you will find me, it is not a mere platitude about treating each other well. It is an ontological, ethical argument about this fall, about the process of going from the fetish object towards the destitute subject, the subject of pure interpassivity, if you will, the subject who is ultimately only responsible for himself and for his own actions and for his own belief. The irony, therefore, is that the existentialist idea of the death of God, of course, prefigured by the Nietzschean idea of the death of God, is already staged within the crucifixion. That the revolution of Christ on the cross is, quite strictly speaking, the death of God, the death of a fetishistic God towards the idea of a God that exists within the Holy Trinity. It's also why, ultimately, idols, the idea of the pagan idol, functions according to the logic of the fetish. Namely, you don't believe in God, you believe in this thing on behalf of believing in God. It's also why so many Christians place such an importance on arguing against false idols, because the idol is the remnant of the pagan fetish within contemporary Christianity. Now, there's a couple arguments that we should pursue here further. I know I'm going a little bit fast, but thank you for bearing with me. Now, we can make a leap here, or I'd like to make a leap here, to the problem of courtly love, the problem of chivalry, if you will. Now, one of the things that chivalry does is that chivalry denies the properly Christian traumatic core of love, namely interpassivity, the subjective destitution, the love with the fall in which you are struck by lightning and your entire world changes. It denies this radical principle of love and instead reverts back to what is a properly pagan attitude towards love. Namely, the upholding of woman as idealized substance, as divine goddess, who believes on my behalf in the idea of love. Think about it. This is what chivalry is in its most formulaic nature, which is, I am a man who is afraid of the idea of a genuine relationship with the other. In other words, I am afraid of being genuinely interpassive with the other, having to assume the identity of partner which thereby implies assuming the identity of my loved one as partner, as fully realized human being. And therefore, to avoid this traumatic content, this confrontation with the other, I have to uphold the idea of a fetishized, ideal object other. That therefore, in treating the let's say the woman, for treating the woman as this damsel in distress, as this divine figure who bestows upon you grace and who gives you missions by which you can prove your honor and receive her acceptance, that this courtly display of love is therefore precisely fetishistic, because it allows for the moment of reunification, the reaching of the object of desire, to be forever delayed, forever to be avoided, and therefore the separation to be upheld between the absolute other of the divine figure of woman versus what is now the activity by which you can go through the world slaying dragons and being a hero and so on and so forth. It's one of the ironies of some of the old Hollywood movies is that often the love interest and the hero will never actually share the screen for a predominant part of the picture, that they will only see each other in the final moments. It's like I was watching a behind-the-scenes documentary for Pirates of the Caribbean, and at a certain point, Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley said that throughout the shooting of the trilogy, they only shared screen time like a handful of times. They barely ever saw each other, which might explain their lack of chemistry. But of course, the chivalrous narrative formula requires that the hero is never actually in the frame with the princess, the heroine he is trying to rescue or save. It's an archetype of a classic sort of chivalrous storytelling thereby, that the moment of unification is forever delayed as long as possible. Now, of course, the analogy that you can make here to the pagan logic, which is maintained within the Old Testament, is the idea of the Father in the sky, the authority of divine bliss and grace, etc., and that man has to try to be worthy of him, but is nevertheless never reunited with him. This is essentially how we transition from the logic of Adam, who has fallen from the Garden of Eden, towards the redemption through the figure of Christ, who is in a sense an inverted Adam, an Adam who not returns to the Garden of Eden, but who transposes the Garden of Eden onto the human plane as such. Now, I want to stress again that this is an ontological transition, by which I mean that it is a philosophical formula by which the very nature of being is radically reframed. The very axis or coordinates of reality are therefore transposed by being the lower life forms on Earth versus the higher ideal transcendental realm versus the transposition, the ontological fall that retroactively generates the ideal within the human community as such. Ironically, this is also how one can interpret Nietzsche's frustration with Wagner. Wagner, one of the greatest opera composers of all time, was also a Christian. And this was something that was untenable for Nietzsche. Nietzsche was, of course, one of the greatest Wagnerians. He himself was a huge admirer of Wagner and then fell completely out of love with Wagner. The specific turning point here is, of course, the ring. The end of the ring cycle in Götterdämmerung sees the burning down of Valhalla and the end of the gods, etc., and therefore the human community that now sees the burning remnants of the godly realm and therefore finds itself confronted with its own ethical responsibility. Now, what's interesting is that Nietzsche saw the ring as being an absolutely unapologetic endorsement of the Christian faith. And here Nietzsche was absolutely correct. Ironically, it is precisely the ring that is the most Christian of Wagner's operas, even though it is framed as a mythologized pagan, Celtic, Celtic would be English, a Teutonic lore of the Ring Saga, of the Nibelungenlied. It is, in fact, if you look at it from a structural component, an entirely Christian logic, which is the fall of the idea of Valhalla, of the higher realm of authority of the gods, and thereby the interpassive subjective destitution that occurs when the community of the humans find themselves on earth without the gods. Ironically, therefore, and this is also why, for example, someone like Slavoj Žižek has argued that the only way to be a true Christian is to embrace the atheist argument. To be a true Christian, therefore, means to understand and accept the atheist core that lies within this Christian logical formulation. That if one refuses to see this death of God that has to occur within the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, one therefore remains slavishly attached to what is essentially a pagan argument, or possibly even a Judaic one in which the Messiah has yet to come. Now, this is also how one should interpret, or actually, can I very briefly, to return to Nietzsche and Wagner, let's complete that. And so Nietzsche was right to some extent in understanding that The Ring was Wagner's most Christian opera. Although what's interesting here, and this is where Nietzsche reveals himself to be fundamentally a pagan to my mind, is that Nietzsche absolutely loved Parsifal. Now, this seems odd because Parsifal is Wagner's seemingly most overt religious opera, namely the opera in which we have the Knights of the Holy Grail searching for the Holy Grail and fighting the sort of fantastical, magical pagan forces in the forest. And yet, fundamentally, the logic underlying Parsifal, although steeped in what is clearly the sort of religious zeal of the Knights Templar, is itself the pagan logic by which the faith relies upon the finding of the fetishistic object of the Holy Grail. After all, what is the Holy Grail if not the ultimate, quote-unquote, divine fetishistic object? The object that can never be attained, that has to be continuously pursued, and in this pursuit, one stages, therefore, one's own loyalty and one's fidelity to the faith. Here again, we have the problem of interactivity versus interpassivity. Interpassivity requiring always subjective destitution. If the fetish upholds the idea that you can spring into action and be the hero who fights dragons and searches for the Holy Grail to appease the maidens, etc., here we have not a genuine love relation. Here we have simply the solipsistic mechanism by which you can embrace your own action and continue to enjoy it for what it is without actually having to engage with the traumatic content of the other's desire. You can simply be your own self while allowing the other to exist as an empty, abstract entity, an idealized substance. Hence also why the Knights Templar and the knight motif as a literary trope persists precisely within the ethical idea of chivalry. The chivalrous knight is therefore the fetishistic knight who allows himself to justify his own actions, his own subjective embrace of his position, which is sustained because the other believes in it for him. The other one wants him to go on his mission, wants him to complete his task, etc. It's a distinctly pagan logic, therefore, that Parsifal upholds. Vice versa, it is precisely the most pagan-looking, at least in costume.
To your Wi-Fi network. Open the Google Home app to reconnect to Wi-Fi.
That is the Google Home Assistant interrupting the lecture. Thank you, Google Home Assistant. It is precisely what appears to be the most pagan opera, the Ring Cycle, where, even today people will show up dressed in like Viking helmets and things like this, which reveals itself to be the most Christian in its logical structure. To reiterate that in a more formulaic sense, the Ring Cycle upholds the Christian argument by which we have the death of God, which is necessitated for the upholding of the Trinity, God within the faithful, which therefore, by death of God, I mean the transposition of the logical authority of God in the sky versus the fallen man into God himself, who was fallen into man through the crucifixion, which is upheld through the Götterdämmerung in the Ring Cycle, versus the fetishistic object-oriented relationship within Parsifal, by which we have the chivalrous knight who looks for the Holy Grail and who fights off mythical foes. Essentially, therefore, Parsifal reveals itself to be the most pagan opera that Wagner ever conducted or composed, whereas the Ring Cycle is the most Christian opera that Wagner ever composed. Hence the understandable revulsion that Nietzsche felt apropos the Ring. However, the reason I can nevertheless not confess myself to be a Nietzschean is that, to my mind, even though Nietzsche proudly declares the death of God, his fundamental ethical stance remains distinctly pagan. It's not that he wants to move beyond the death of God, instead he wants to revert back to a previous position in which the death of God had not yet been necessitated. Therefore, the secret core of Nietzsche, which I find to be repulsive, is that it is a reactionary stance that refuses to examine or accept the properly revolutionary turn that takes place within the New Testament, and therefore advocates for a return to a pagan, pre-Christian, personal solipsistic morality by which one is determined by one's own subjective will and action. This undermines and completely fails to examine what I called before the subjective dispossession that occurs within the Christian faith. And this is again where we have to return to love. Let's go back to the motif of love without the fall. Fundamentally, it is only love if it has the fall. Subjective destitution is one of the central aspects of love. Namely, the paradox by which you appear to realize your highest necessity by means of completely falling out of the orbit of your own existence, of the things that you thought were important and that which you thought you were living for. Therefore, when you are in love, the classical motif of being, struck by Cupid's arrow presents itself as a subjective disaster, not as the romantic transcendental idealism of ascending to a higher plane of existence, but rather being cast into the lowest aspect of existence. Never has there been more wisdom to the aphorism that there is more truth to the bottom than there is to the top. When you fall in love, at first, you are cast into the pit, into rock bottom, because everything that used to make you happy now no longer sustains you. Everything that used to subjectively order your life with no longer appears to make sense with you unless you are with the other. Now, what happens here, of course, is that love, therefore, presents itself as a violent event. It's also why Slavoj Žižek has said that in order to properly understand the ethical components of love, we have to understand that love is a deeply violent gesture. Not because in some pop psychological way, love makes us commit acts of what the French used to call crimes of passion, but because love disrupts and radically distorts our subjective stance on reality. It presents itself as a violent event to us. Think about it, it will make you suddenly not spend time with your friends or be uninterested in your job, or the things that used to give you joy no longer give you joy. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago in the lecture, the Thomas Mann story, Herr Friedemann, where a man falls in love and suddenly realizes that he goes back to his study and his books suddenly contain nothing but mere abstractions and his flowers no longer smell rosy, etc. It's like suddenly life is drained of color. It is painted in gray if you are not with the person that you are in love with. Love presents its therefore as a subjective loss, as a subjective destitution. And this is ironically then mirrored back into the couple, the creation of the couple. Let me expand. The creation of the couple is precisely not to say I have found the fetishistic object who completes me. This would be a poor semblance of happy romantic relationships to say I have found someone who completes me. I have found the person who believes in me completely, on whose behalf I can act and do whatever I want because now I have someone who's taking care of me. Instead, what love fundamentally is a form of the embrace of interpassive subjective destitution, which is not just word salad. I'm actually being as clear as I can possibly be here. It is interpassive because the fall into love implies a double fall, a mirror fault by which you both fall into each other's love. This can never simply be a mere interaction. After all, if it simply were, we are now a couple because we've signed a contract or we've legalistically figured out what our terms of engagement are, it would by definition no longer be love. It's one of the paradoxes of love that if you were to simply write down what you like about the other person, you would miss the ineffable X of love. You would no longer have the thing that truly characterizes love, which by its very nature is fleeting or abstract, excessive. It's also when Lacan says that what you love is the lack in the other, he means this quite literally. This lack is this ineffable thing that is in a sense only materialized sublimely by the fact that it cannot be properly quantified. As I've mentioned many times before, the famous Shakespeare sonnet, which is, I love you so much I couldn't possibly put it into words, therefore I have just put into words just how much you love you, namely, I love you so much that it is impossible for me to put it into words. This is the Kantian sublime, essentially. The ineffable X, the lack in the other, is therefore not the fetishistic object that fills in the absence of the other on your behalf so that it believes in love for you, but rather the lack that creates the ethical subjective destitution by which you now have to embrace love in your own stead. You have to step into the gap and believe in it yourself. No one can do it for you. This is why love is such a crucial element within the Christian faith. It's not simply to treat each other well and to turn the other cheek, which was an aspect of Christianity that lent itself all too well as a supplement to bourgeois morality and ideology within capitalism. But that's for another time. Instead, it's this interpassive subjective destitution by which you properly embrace the full ethical weight of having to accept and embrace and take responsibility for your actions. Within love, there is no deferring of responsibility. Someone else does it for me. They believe it on my behalf. Even giving someone flowers or a cheap Valentine's Day card already feels like you have left the loving to somebody else. Even telling someone you love them feels like you've left it to the words, to the signifier, instead of demonstrating this ineffable thing to them each and every day in new and surprising ways. And therefore this lack, this gap of love around which two people interpassively give themselves is the creation of this new ethical thing. It's the moving away from the fetishistic object. Now, of course, this kind of love can never take place within the logical structure of chivalry. Chivalry, by its very nature, feigns the interpassive stance by which the knight in shining armor supposedly gives himself completely to the woman, and yet fundamentally allows the woman to exist on another plane of reality that cannot be reached, so that the man can simply go on about his merry ways, doing things on behalf of the woman which she may have never asked for in the first place. In other words, chivalrous love is a false destitution, which feigns to give everything to the woman, but in fact egoistically retains everything for the man himself. Hence also why chivalry so often, at least in contemporary terms, leads to its exact opposite, which is a hatred of women. Which is to say that the man who treats the woman in a chivalrous way and nevertheless finds himself rebuffed by her, as she easily sees through the fact that chivalry has less to do with her and everything to do with him, will therefore respond in anger to the woman, stating, "How is it that you don't want my chivalrous act? Therefore you are not only not worthy of my love, you are not a true woman." This universalization of woman into an ideal substance is therefore precisely the primary dehumanization of woman. And if you go back over the course of history, the greatest historical crimes have always taken place under the auspices of the universalization, not the particularization. The most criminal version of this, of course, is anti-Semitism, specifically that practiced by the Nazis. The figure of the Jew is precisely the Jew as fetish object, the universalized substance of the enemy figure of the Jew is the subjective elimination of the particularity of Jewish people as such. This is something that Primo Levi wrote about his experience in the concentration camps. He says one of the most profoundly dehumanizing things he realized in the concentration camps was that he was confronted with the reality that he found different types of Jews from different parts of Europe with different life experiences, different languages, and yet they were all considered to be the Jew. That fundamentally the dehumanizing gesture is therefore always the universal one, the one that argues for the nondescript, abstract universal that cannot hold on to a particular. In the same way, although we shouldn't extrapolate too directly between anti-Semitism and a hatred of women, but in the same fundamental formulaic way, structurally, we can see therefore how the love of woman in the abstract on the universal level therefore always implies the hatred of women, the attempt to dehumanize and objectify women. And any idealization of womanhood on the level of the universal should therefore always be treated with the greatest of suspicion. At least that is my belief. We could also make a link here. I don't want to go on a tangent, but this is also part of the leftist critique of the idea of human rights. One doesn't have to be a leftist. Even Hannah Arendt was critical of the idea of human rights, by arguing that human rights raises what should be the particular concerns of people, namely the right to property, the right to safety, the right to education, the right, so many other rights, raises it to some ontological zero-sum level of absolute universality, human rights, which of course is precisely the right that was given to those people who have already been stripped of all of their other rights. We only talk about human rights once you are already at the basement level of human ethical subjectivity. Now, to return to the argument about the fetish. Thank you for letting me go fast, by the way. It's a lot to put into 45 minutes. To return to the argument about the fetish, what we see within Christ on the cross, fetish or not, is therefore distinctly the no longer fetishized figure. The fetish figure, therefore, is precisely the deity in the sky. The idea of God with a beard, the heavenly Father, is the fetish object par excellence. And what Christ on the cross and the revolution that occurs from the Old Testament to the New Testament represents is precisely the emptying out of this fetishistic divinity into the properly intersubjectively destituted subjectivity of redeemed man, of the redemption of man. And here redemption is actually key, and Nietzsche is quite right to emphasize that Wagner is all about redemption from a Christian perspective, which Nietzsche finds to be repulsive, of course, is that in the ontological order by which Adam has to fall from the Garden of Eden, which G.K. Chesterton already calls the obscene core of Christianity, namely that Christianity only functions as long as it necessitates this primordial crime. Hence the question becomes, did God need Adam to fall? Was this necessary? Was this preordained? That the emergence of sin in the world, therefore, is something which is necessitated. And that Christ is therefore not the Redeemer who simply forgives Adam's sin so that Adam can then be brought back into heavenly paradise, the Garden of Eden. But in a sense, much more crucially, it is Christ who redeems God. It is Christ who forgives God the primordial sin of necessitating Adam, and of course, in that turn, necessitating Christ. And so the tragedy, the suffering of Adam is equal to the suffering of Christ, both of which who exist as two sides of the same coin, the dialectical redemption of the one who is suffering in the ultimate way, which is of course God himself. And now we find ourselves back at Slavoj Žižek's argument of God in pain, God in suffering. That this God who cannot be ontologically complete without succumbing to this dual dialectical fall, the fall of man and then the fall of Christ, in order to redeem God, to ontologically transpose him back into the community of the faithful, that this indeed is a God in pain. And that, of course, is the revolutionary aspect by which we go from the illusion, the fantasy object, which is the object, the fetish, into the properly subjectively destituted position of man, which is therefore mirrored in the subjective destitution of God himself. That what occurs on the cross is therefore not just the opening up of love through the subjective destitution of man and the interpassivity required by the faith, but precisely the subjective destitution of God himself, God in pain. That is Žižek's argument. Now, as a final concluding point, which we will continue in next week's lecture, we can make here an argument about Marx's commodity fetish as well. Remember, for Marx, the commodity fetish isn't simply that you could walk up to someone who believes in the commodity fetish, who, spends all their time thinking about buying a Bugatti or the next brand of, the next drop of Nike shoes. It's not simply that the Marxist would go up to this person and say, can't you believe that the commodity fetish isn't real? I can't believe that you're spending all your time worshiping empty things. How have you lost the true meaning of life? This wouldn't be a Marxist. This would be a kind of pop pseudo-Buddhist pagan in disguise who would simply say, don't you know that these objects are empty? Why do you worship them as false idols? The properly Marxist gesture instead is to say, you are right in assuming that these objective neutral things have seemingly magical properties, that the cars and the shoes aren't just cars and shoes, but something bigger, namely that which is the objective stand-in for the reproduction of social relations amongst men. This is something that a lot of people tend to fail to realize about Marxism. Marxism isn't simply waving a finger and saying, how could you possibly believe in the fetish object? Can't you see that it's simply branding and that it's all fake? Marxism does the exact opposite. It says it's precisely because it's fake that it is all too real. It is this abstract, empty entity that allows for the reproduction of interactive social relations. And now, my dear friends, we can go all the way back to the beginning of this lecture. Remember, I argued that the central principle or aspect of pagan relations is that it has this empty goat that has to be slaughtered, that is essentially abstract, that doesn't serve for the authentic exchange between God and man. It simply serves to reproduce the hierarchical social principles by which God and man remain forever detached, God in the sky, man below, that therefore the pagan exchange of do ut date is the exchange of the commodity. That is Marx's argument about the commodity fetish. That the commodity fetish is essentially the pagan principle transposed onto capitalism. In fact, that the entire so-called Protestant ethic, which Max Weber famously relates to the spirit of capitalism, is the return of the pagan ethic within the Christian faith, therefore transposed onto the bourgeois moral participation in the appropriation of commodities and therefore the reproduction of the subject as the reproduction of social relationships sustained by the fetish object. That is the commodity fetish. And so in a very similar way, the Marxist take on the commodity fetish is therefore precisely to say that the interactive stance between man is upheld, but that the subjective destitution of love, of agape, of authentic interpassive subjectivity remains forever barred. And the Marxist name for this is, of course, alienation. And that is why alienation can never simply be solved by a return to nature, a return to authentic natural living, moving away from the commodities. It is not a return back to, one has to go through the commodity itself. Revolution for Marx is never simply an antithesis to the existing order, but the necessary historical development of the inner contradictions, the internal limit of that which is disavowed within the capitalist order. Hence, the Marxist critique of the commodity fetish can therefore be likened to the critique of the pagan fetish that allows the existing hierarchy of God in the sky and man below to be sustained and reproduced within capitalism, of course now within a kind of neo-feudal exploitationist system by which we have the billionaire in the sky and poor man below who wants to become reunited with the transcendental realm of the rich and famous by means of participating in the empty exchange of the commodity fetish, namely the fetishistic object of worship that is the sublime object of ideology, as Zizek puts it, within capitalism. That, my friends, is the entire lecture. The transition from Christ on the cross towards the critique of the commodity fetish in 45 minutes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know this has been a lot, but I hope that it has been fruitful. I hope that it has opened up new avenues of inquiry for yourselves, that you want to go out into the world and read and write and debate and discuss and look at art and just take everything in. That would be my dream, that this is something that lights a fire in your minds and in your souls. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this and if you'd like to download my lectures and my ebook, you can become a patron, or you can simply donate $5 by becoming a subscriber on Instagram, which gives you access to exclusive posts that I do for members, like reading recommendations and little mini tutorials. Thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate you. I've had such a good time this Monday morning. I will see you soon. Bye, guys.